What happens when a country music legend, someone whose music has resonated with millions, walks onto one of daytime television's most unpredictable stages and refuses to follow the script? Well, what started as a simple interview turns into a fiery clash that leaves everyone in the room, audience and producers alike, stunned. The tension in the air is palpable as the show transforms from a light-hearted chat into one of the most talked-about confrontations in talk show history. Before we dive into the details of what exactly went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss a single moment of this heated exchange. And while you're at it, drop a comment below to tell us what you think about celebrity interviews that veer off course. Do you think guests should toe the line or stand their ground when the conversation goes sideways? It was a typical day at the studio, with lights blazing down on the set as Alan Jackson, the towering figure of country music, made his entrance. His cowboy hat sat snugly on his head, a signature look that never failed to turn heads. As the opening credits of The View rolled to a close, the audience buzzed with energy, eager for the next segment. Joy Behar, ever poised, sat across from him, notes neatly arranged before her as the other hosts gave their usual polite nods. Everything seemed normal. A typical interview with a celebrity about new music, the kind of easy conversation that the audience had come to expect. But, as you know, things are rarely as simple as they seem, especially when it involves people who are used to standing their ground. Joy started off with a seemingly benign question about Alan's latest album. She asked him about his thoughts on the current state of country music, an easy segue into a comfortable discussion. Alan, as expected, leaned back in his chair, his southern drawl filling the air as he talked about how he had always remained true to the genre's traditional sounds. For him, country music was about storytelling, tales that resonated with hardworking people. His passion for his fans and his desire to keep the music authentic were clear as he spoke. The other hosts smiled, nodding along in agreement, their faces warm, encouraging him to continue. It was all smiles and easy conversation. Until it wasn't. Just as Alan was getting comfortable in his thoughts, Joy, ever the skilled interviewer, took a sharp turn. With a careful glance at her notes, she raised a question about the recent trend of country artists using their platforms to speak out on political matters. She mentioned a few high-profile figures who had used award shows to voice their opinions on social issues, and then asked Alan point-blank, what did he think about musicians using their fame to push political messages? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. For a brief moment, Alan's face remained calm, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. His usual confidence wavered slightly as he gathered his thoughts. His response was measured but firm. He explained that, in his view, music should serve to unite people, not divide them. He had always aimed to create music that spoke to universal human experiences, songs that anyone, regardless of their political beliefs, could enjoy. He believed his music was a form of connection, not a political battleground. However, Joy wasn't satisfied with the answer. She leaned forward, her voice sharp, pressing him for more. But isn't silence itself a political statement? She asked, implying that by not taking a stand, Alan was implicitly endorsing the status quo. The tension in the room shifted. The mood was no longer light, and the once friendly atmosphere now felt charged. Alan, who had always chosen to stay away from political debates in favor of focusing on his music, was now thrust into a conversation he clearly wasn't prepared for. He tried to explain that not every issue needed to be discussed through the lens of politics. People, he argued, sometimes just wanted to hear a good song without being lectured or made to feel like they needed to pick sides. Joy pressed him further, her tone now tinged with an edge. She pointed out that some issues, like social justice, weren't about personal preference. They were about right and wrong. She suggested that the refusal to speak out on important topics could be seen as complicity, a dangerous silence that allowed injustice to persist. Alan, not one to back down, countered calmly but firmly. He said that he respected everyone's right to speak their mind, but that he didn't believe everything had to be politicized. His fans, he believed, weren't looking for a political sermon. They were looking for a connection, something real and grounded in the everyday. The conversation was no longer just about country music. The stakes had risen. The studio's atmosphere had shifted from light-hearted to tense as Alan and Joy sparred over deeply rooted values. And yet, both stood their ground. Alan wasn't about to let anyone dictate how he should express his beliefs, especially not in front of millions of viewers. As the tension in the room thickened, Joy didn't back down. She continued to press, suggesting that privilege allowed some individuals, like Alan, to sidestep uncomfortable conversations about social issues. She argued that by not engaging with these issues, people were, in essence, refusing to face the harsh realities that many others lived through every day. Alan's response was swift and calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in his voice. He told Joy that it wasn't about privilege, it was about respecting diverse perspectives. Not everyone, he explained, had the same experiences, and not everyone saw the world through the same lens. For him, staying true to his values meant respecting that difference, and understanding that the world was far more complicated than a binary of right and wrong. As the two continued to lock horns, it became clear that this was no longer a simple debate over politics and music. It was a clash of world views. Alan spoke about his upbringing in a small Georgia town, where he worked hard in manual labor jobs before music ever became his career. He wasn't blind to hardship, he explained. In fact, he had lived it. But the divide between his world and Joy's was growing, as she continued to challenge his stance on what she believed was his refusal to confront certain societal issues head-on. But Alan didn't flinch. He stood his ground, asserting that the real issue wasn't about being politically correct. It was about genuine human connection. Music, for him, was always about reaching across those divides and finding common ground. It wasn't about tearing people down for their beliefs or imposing one set of values on everyone else. The debate between Alan and Joy reached a new level when the conversation turned personal. It was no longer just about music or politics. Now, it was about their core beliefs and values. Joy, ever the outspoken voice, leaned forward and made a pointed comment about how privilege often shielded people from having to deal with difficult truths. She suggested that Alan, with his successful career and comfortable lifestyle, might not fully grasp the weight of issues affecting people in marginalized communities. Alan's eyes narrowed as he listened, his patience starting to wear thin. He wasn't about to let Joy define his perspective based on her assumptions about his life. He responded firmly, making it clear that growing up in a small town in Georgia, working hard with his hands before he ever touched a guitar, had given him a first-hand understanding of struggle. He wasn't oblivious to the challenges faced by everyday people. In fact, his music had always been rooted in those very experiences. Joy, however, wasn't deterred. She shot back with a pointed comment, suggesting that just because Alan had experienced hardship didn't mean he understood the full scope of the issues others faced. She challenged him, implying that his refusal to speak out on political issues meant he wasn't truly engaging with the real struggles people were dealing with every day. For a moment, the room grew silent. The other hosts, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension, exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether to intervene or let the conversation play out. Alan, however, remained calm. He stood firm in his belief that his music spoke for itself. He had always tried to give people something real to connect with, something they could hold on to when the world felt overwhelming. And yet, Joy wasn't finished. She continued to press him, saying that not addressing issues head-on, especially when it came to inequality and justice, was a form of avoidance. She implied that people like Alan, who avoided the tough topics, were part of the problem. The verbal sparring between Joy and Alan became even more intense as the conversation delved deeper into the idea of personal responsibility. For Joy, the belief that silence equaled complicity was not just an opinion. It was a moral stance. She wasn't merely challenging Alan's views on music and politics. She was questioning his integrity and his sense of duty as a public figure. To her, silence in the face of injustice wasn't just passive, it was an active form of harm. Alan, however, was unwavering. He firmly rejected the idea that staying silent meant endorsing injustice. He didn't believe in making every issue a political battleground. For him, it was about the bigger picture, the music, the stories, and the connection with his fans. His refusal to engage in the political sphere wasn't a rejection of social issues. It was a recognition that not every conversation needed to be politicized. But Joy wasn't convinced. She pressed him, stating that public figures had a responsibility to take a stand on important matters. She argued that silence didn't just allow injustice to persist, it enabled it. She painted Alan's position as a form of privilege, suggesting that by refusing to speak out, he was contributing to a culture of complacency. The tension in the room continued to rise as the two continued to clash. Alan's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Joy's increasing agitation. It was clear that both had deeply held beliefs, and neither was willing to back down. The conversation had long since left the realm of music and entertainment. It was now a battle of values, a clash between two ideologies that couldn't have been further apart. As the conversation raged on, it became clear that there was no turning back. The debate had gone from heated to personal, and the room was now charged with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. Alan had never been one to shy away from tough conversations, but this wasn't just about disagreeing, it was about being personally attacked. Joy had, in no uncertain terms, implied that Alan's refusal to speak out on political issues made him complicit in the problems he refused to address. She had questioned his commitment to equality and justice, and in doing so, had painted him as a figure who lacked the moral courage to take a stand. For Alan, this was a step too far. He responded, his voice low and controlled, but laced with an unmistakable edge. He wasn't going to let Joy define him. He wasn't going to sit there and be lectured about his values by someone who clearly misunderstood the essence of who he was. Alan wasn't a stranger to hardship, nor was he afraid of speaking his mind. But he wasn't going to let anyone, especially not Joy, tell him what he should believe or how he should express those beliefs. It was at this point that the conversation took a dramatic turn. Alan leaned forward, his tone firm as he told Joy that he respected her right to voice her opinions, but that he wouldn't accept being painted as morally inferior simply because he didn't share her political stance. He rejected the premise that silence in the face of injustice made him complicit. To him, it wasn't silence. It was simply a refusal to engage in a conversation that wasn't about finding common ground, but about forcing a particular ideological narrative. By this point, the tension between Alan and Joy was palpable. It was clear that this was no longer just a disagreement. It was a breakdown of respect. Alan had made it clear that he wasn't interested in being part of a conversation that was designed to manipulate him into agreeing with a predetermined narrative. He wasn't here to be a pawn in a political game, and he wasn't going to let Joy turn the interview into a moral inquisition. But Joy, equally resolute in her beliefs, wasn't backing down either. She stood firm in her conviction that public figures like Alan had a responsibility to speak out on issues that mattered. To her, silence in the face of inequality was a form of complicity, and she wasn't afraid to call it out. The other hosts, who had been trying to stay out of the fray, could no longer ignore the tension between the two. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted entirely, and it was clear that this conversation was no longer about the usual celebrity banter. It was about something much deeper. And then, in a moment that stunned everyone in the room, Alan stood up. His cowboy hat, which had been a fixture on his head throughout the conversation, was now placed carefully on the couch beside him. His voice, which had been calm and measured throughout the exchange, suddenly dropped in intensity, but the words he spoke were anything but soft. He made it clear that he wasn't going to be a part of this conversation anymore. It wasn't because Joy had asked him to leave. It was because he had reached the point where he no longer felt it was a conversation worth having. The stakes had shifted, and he wasn't going to continue a dialogue where the rules were rigged from the start. The studio fell silent as Alan made his decision. It wasn't just a physical act of standing up. It was a symbolic moment of breaking away from a conversation that had stopped being constructive. As he placed his cowboy hat on the couch beside him, his words were deliberate, almost measured as he explained why he was walking away. It wasn't because Joy had told him to leave. It was because he had realized that the conversation was no longer about exchanging ideas or finding common ground. It had become about forcing a particular perspective, about coercing him into a narrative that wasn't his. His calm yet firm stance shocked everyone in the room, especially Joy. She had expected him to either cave to the pressure or continue engaging in a battle of words. But instead, Alan chose to remove himself from the situation. "You've made your points," Alan said quietly, "and I've made mine. But this isn't going anywhere productive. So, I'll leave, not because you asked me to, but because I believe this conversation is over." Joy, clearly caught off guard by his exit, attempted to reclaim control of the moment. She shot back almost immediately, saying, "Well, if walking away is how you handle tough conversations, that's exactly the problem I've been talking about." There was an icy edge to her words now, a coldness that was as sharp as it was final. Alan's eyes briefly met hers, his expression unchanging. He wasn't going to get into a verbal sparring match anymore. He had already said what needed to be said. "You can spin it however you want," Alan replied. "But if you think walking away means I'm avoiding tough conversations, then maybe you need to examine why you're more interested in scoring a point than actually having a discussion." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit. The tension in the room, palpable just moments before, seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. Everyone in the studio was left in stunned silence, processing the abrupt shift from a highly charged debate to a quiet exit. As Alan left the set, the atmosphere in the studio shifted dramatically. What had started as a professional interview about music had devolved into something much darker. The remaining hosts, visibly uncomfortable, exchanged nervous glances. They had been caught in the middle of a verbal clash that had gone far beyond the typical celebrity chat. Joy, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and indignation, turned to her colleagues. "Did you see that?" she asked, as if trying to make sense of the situation. "He's not willing to confront the real issues, and he thinks walking out somehow makes him the bigger person?" The other hosts were quiet for a moment, unsure of how to respond. They had seen the tension build throughout the interview, but even they hadn't expected it to culminate in such a dramatic exit. The energy in the room was noticeably subdued, and it was clear that this wasn't a typical post-interview debrief. One of the hosts, attempting to salvage the situation, awkwardly shifted the conversation back to Alan's music. "Well, that was certainly an intense moment, but let's try to remember that we're here to talk about his new album. It's an exciting project, and we should focus on that." But the damage had been done. The moment of confrontation had already overshadowed the entire interview. The show tried to move on, but it was clear that the energy had completely shifted. There was an underlying tension in the studio, a feeling that no one could ignore. The audience, whether tuning in live or watching the clip later, would not forget what had just unfolded. Back in the control room, the producers were undoubtedly scrambling to figure out how to handle the aftermath. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. It was an all-out battle of ideals. The network had to decide whether to release the footage, knowing that it would likely go viral, or to bury it and avoid the potential backlash from both Alan's fans and Joy's supporters. As the show wrapped up, Joy's usual confident, polished demeanor had faltered. The argument had been more than just a difference of opinion. It had been a personal confrontation, one that blurred the line between entertainment and genuine ideological conflict. The interview, which was supposed to highlight Alan's music and promote his new project, had instead become the focal point of a much larger debate. Was Alan right to stand his ground, or had he missed an opportunity to engage with Joy on important social issues? And for Joy, had she pushed too hard, or was her insistence on pressing him a necessary act of accountability? Social media exploded with mixed reactions. Some praised Alan for standing up for his values and refusing to be coerced into a political stance he didn't agree with. They saw his exit as an act of defiance against the pressure to conform to the prevailing narrative. Others, however, criticized him for walking away instead of engaging with the tough issues Joy had raised, calling him out for avoiding responsibility. For Joy, the situation was equally complex. Her supporters hailed her for challenging Alan and forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. To them, she was the voice of reason, standing up for the marginalized and holding Alan accountable for his silence. Yet, her critics accused her of using the platform to push a personal agenda, turning what should have been a conversation into a moral battleground. In the end, both sides had made their points, but the fallout from the interview would linger long after the cameras had stopped rolling. The episode would go down in history not for what was said about music, but for what was left unsaid about society's most pressing issues. As the days passed, the public's reaction to the interview continued to ripple through social media, news outlets, and blogs. This wasn't just a story about a celebrity interview gone wrong. It was a microcosm of the larger political and cultural battles happening across the country. People who had never followed The View before now found themselves debating the moral implications of the conversation, with both sides doubling down on their positions. Fans of Alan Jackson took to Twitter. Posting messages of support for their country music hero, they praised him for not being intimidated into speaking out on issues he didn't believe in, calling him a voice of reason in an increasingly polarized world. Some even went as far as to say that Alan's exit was symbolic of the way many Americans felt, caught between competing ideologies, unsure of who to trust. On the other side of the debate, Joy's supporters rallied around her, claiming that her persistence in asking tough questions was what was needed to bring about change. They applauded her for challenging Alan to take a stance, arguing that his silence on important matters was a betrayal of the very people his music claimed to represent. The internet was alive with back-and-forth arguments, memes, and hashtags as people from all walks of life weighed in on what had been one of the most charged interviews in recent memory. Both Alan and Joy had become symbols. Alan of the unyielding desire to maintain personal integrity, and Joy of the relentless pursuit of accountability, no matter the cost. As the dust settled, both Alan and Joy had to come to terms with what had transpired. For Alan, the interview had been a moment of clarity, a reminder of why he had always focused on his music rather than political commentary. He had chosen his path years ago, and he wasn't going to change it for anyone. His fans appreciated his authenticity, and that was enough for him. For Joy, the experience had been a wake-up call. She realized that her role as a talk show host was more than just asking questions. It was about creating an environment where true dialogue could happen, where people with differing views could engage respectfully. The interview had spiraled out of control because both sides had become entrenched in their own beliefs. And while she still believed in the importance of holding public figures accountable, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to ask tough questions without turning them into confrontations. In the end, both Alan and Joy walked away with a sense of having stood their ground, but the question remained: had either truly listened to the other? Had either truly tried to understand the other's perspective? The answer, as it often is in these types of interviews, was left hanging in the air, an unresolved tension that would continue to simmer long after the cameras stopped rolling. As the media frenzy continued, both Alan and Joy found themselves in the midst of a larger conversation about celebrity influence, political responsibility, and the nature of public discourse. The interview had gone viral, not just because of its explosive moments, but because it encapsulated the very tension that defines modern-day conversations about social justice, celebrity activism, and personal responsibility. For Alan, the debate was much more than a matter of political ideology. It was about his authenticity. He had spent decades crafting a career built on real, heartfelt music that resonated with everyday people, and that was where he believed his role lay. His music was his voice, and through it he had always tried to stay true to the values that mattered most to him: family, faith, and the simple joys of life. His fans, people who had followed him through thick and thin, knew who he was. They respected him because he didn't try to be anything other than what he was: a man who loved his craft, his country, and his community. But for Joy, the bigger picture was about more than just personal authenticity. It was about using platforms to amplify the voices of the voiceless. She had spent years working as a journalist, seeking out the stories that others weren't telling. She believed that public figures, especially those with massive platforms, had a moral duty to use their influence for more than just entertainment. It wasn't enough to simply exist in the world. They had a responsibility to engage with it, to challenge the status quo, and to speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The problem, however, was that Joy's definition of what it meant to speak up often clashed with Alan's definition of what it meant to be authentic. To him, silence didn't equate to complicity. It was simply a refusal to jump into a political conversation that didn't align with his values. But to Joy, not engaging with issues like inequality and injustice was a failure of responsibility, especially when those issues were at the forefront of national conversation. As the debate continued to unfold in the media, one of the most interesting aspects of the entire exchange was the public's reaction. The interview had sparked a broader conversation, one that asked questions about what it meant to be a responsible public figure in today's world. Was it enough to just stay silent on hot-button issues, or did silence equal complicity? Social media platforms were buzzing with opinions, memes, and hashtags in support of both sides. On one hand, there were those who hailed Alan for his refusal to let himself be manipulated into a political stance he didn't believe in. They saw his exit as an act of defiance against the increasing pressure to conform to a particular narrative. They praised him for standing up for his right to focus on what mattered most to him, his music and the connection he had with his fans. On the other hand, there were those who saw Joy as the hero of the story. They applauded her for holding Alan accountable, for pressing him to confront the uncomfortable issues that many people faced every day. They argued that celebrities had a duty to use their platforms for more than just entertainment, that they should be using their influence to tackle the social issues that were plaguing the nation. Joy had, in their eyes, done what was necessary. She had forced Alan to confront his privilege and challenge his silence on important matters. The public conversation about the interview became a microcosm of the larger cultural and political divides in the country. People who had never given much thought to the role of celebrities in politics now found themselves debating it fiercely. What responsibility did public figures have to speak out on important issues? Did they have a moral duty to use their influence to support causes they believed in? And if they didn't, should they be criticized or respected for choosing to stay silent? In the aftermath of the interview, the question of celebrity activism became even more pressing. Alan Jackson and Joy Behar had represented two opposing sides of a growing debate about what it meant to be a responsible public figure in today's divided world. For some, the idea of celebrity activism felt like a natural extension of fame, a way for influential figures to use their platforms to effect change. For others, it felt like an imposition, a way of forcing personal beliefs onto an audience that might not share the same values. The question that lingered was whether celebrity activism was truly effective, or if it simply served to further divide the public. Was it enough for celebrities to speak out on social issues, or did they need to actively work toward tangible change? And could they do so without alienating large swaths of their audience? For Alan, the answer was clear. He believed that his music was his contribution to the world. He didn't need to be a political activist to make a difference. He believed that by staying true to his roots and creating music that spoke to the hearts of everyday people, he was already doing something meaningful. For him, authenticity was more important than any political message, but for Joy, the answer was more complicated. She saw celebrity activism as essential to shifting the cultural conversation. Public figures, she believed, had the power to use their platforms for good, to bring attention to causes that might otherwise be ignored. She wasn't asking every celebrity to be an expert on every issue, but she did believe that they had a duty to engage with the world around them and use their influence to make it a better place. As the months went by, the interview continued to be a topic of conversation. Alan Jackson's fans continued to support him, with many of them praising him for sticking to his guns and refusing to be manipulated into a conversation he didn't want to have. Meanwhile, Joy's supporters continued to push for greater accountability, arguing that her role as a journalist was to challenge her guests, even when it made them uncomfortable. In the end, what was clear was that the interview had sparked a much-needed conversation about the role of celebrities in modern society. Whether or not they agreed with Alan or Joy, the public had been forced to think more critically about the expectations placed on public figures, and what it meant to be an active participant in today's cultural and political conversations. For Alan, the interview was a reminder of why he had always kept his music at the center of his career. He had never needed to be anything more than what he was, an artist who sang about the experiences of everyday people. And for Joy, the interview was a reminder of the importance of holding people accountable, even when it meant risking personal conflict. The interview had gone viral because it was raw, real, and above all, it was a conversation that people could not ignore. As we reflect on this unforgettable interview, one thing is clear. Both Alan Jackson and Joy Behar had stayed true to their beliefs, and in doing so, had sparked a conversation that extended far beyond the confines of a daytime talk show. In a world where silence often speaks louder than words, this exchange was a stark reminder that conversations about values, responsibility, and influence are far from over. What do you think? Was Alan right to walk away, or did he miss an opportunity to engage on crucial social issues? Was Joy justified in pressing him for answers, or was she too forceful? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the unforgettable moments when celebrity interviews go completely off the rails.